Most older men believe a woman will tell them directly when she's interested. They imagine it would sound like a clear compliment, an obvious invitation, something that leaves no room for doubt. The truth is, she almost never does it that way, especially if she's younger than you and aware of exactly how that dynamic looks to the people around her. Instead of saying it, she asks questions, ordinary-sounding questions, the kind that could pass for small talk if you weren't paying attention. And underneath those questions, more often than most men realize, is something real: interest. Curiosity that isn't casual at all, an invitation dressed up as conversation. By the time most men walk away from that exchange, they think they simply had a pleasant chat. She walks away already knowing exactly how you responded to something far more important than either of you said out loud. Stay with me, because the third question we cover today is the one that most older men completely miss, and it is usually the clearest invitation of all four, arriving so casually that most men answer it and move on within seconds, never realizing what they just let pass by. What makes this so easy to miss is that none of these three moments feel significant while they're happening. There's no shift in her tone that announces itself, no dramatic pause, nothing that would make a man sit up and pay closer attention the way an obvious flirtation would. That's not an accident, and it's not her being manipulative either. It's simply the safest way for her to extend interest without the exposure of stating it outright. And it works precisely because it doesn't look like anything at all on the surface. Let's start with why she communicates this way in the first place, because understanding the reason changes how you hear everything that comes afterward. A younger woman spending real time with an older man is aware, almost constantly, of how that choice looks from the outside. She knows some people will assume the wrong things about why she's here. She knows a direct, obvious expression of interest carries a kind of exposure that a carefully placed question simply doesn't. If she says something obvious and you don't respond the way she hopes, she has revealed herself completely, with nowhere to retreat to. A question, on the other hand, gives her exactly what she needs: plausible deniability if it doesn't land the way she wants, and total clarity if it does. This is Nathan, and today we're breaking down the three specific questions younger women use to open a door, quietly, without ever having to admit they opened it at all. This is actually good news, once you understand it correctly, because it means the signals are there far more often than most men assume. The problem was never that she wasn't interested. The problem was that most men were listening for the wrong kind of sentence entirely, waiting for something that announces itself when the real signal has been arriving quietly, disguised as ordinary curiosity the entire time. Here is the first question, and it usually shows up early, often within the first real conversation that goes beyond surface pleasantries. She'll ask something like, "What does someone like you actually want right now?" Or she'll frame it more personally, something closer to, "How has nobody snapped you up yet?" On the surface, it sounds like idle curiosity about your situation. Underneath, she is opening a door for you to talk about yourself in a way that invites her in, rather than shutting the topic down as irrelevant to her. Most men treat this question as a formality and give a short, dismissive answer, something like, "Just haven't found the right person," said flatly, and then they change the subject entirely. That flat redirect is a missed opportunity, not because the answer was wrong, but because it closed a door she had just quietly opened. When a man instead answers honestly, with a little warmth and a touch of vulnerability, and lets the conversation stay open a moment longer instead of rushing past it, she reads that as an invitation returned, not just information delivered. The men who recognize this question for what it is don't overthink the content of their answer. They simply understand that the real message underneath her words is, "I'm curious about your life, tell me more." And they respond to that underlying invitation instead of just answering the surface question efficiently and moving on. The men who recognize this question for what it is don't overthink the content of their answer. They simply understand that the real message underneath her words is, "I'm curious about your life, tell me more," and they respond to that underlying invitation instead of just answering the surface question efficiently and moving on. Picture the same question landing on two different men. She asks, almost lightly, how someone like you is still single. The first man answers in one flat sentence and immediately pivots to a different topic, maybe asking about her day instead, treating the moment as something to get past quickly. The second man pauses for a beat, answers with a little honesty and a touch of self-aware humor, and then turns the question gently back toward her, curious what she imagines the answer might be. Nothing about the second response is calculated or clever. It simply stays in the moment a few seconds longer. And that small difference in presence is often the entire difference between a door left open and a door quietly closed without either person mentioning it. Here is the second question, and this one is more subtle because it rarely sounds like it's about you at all. She'll mention someone from her life, an ex, a friend's husband, sometimes even a man who's been texting her, and she'll watch gently for how you take it in. It might come as an offhand comment about someone who let her down, or someone who never treated her the way she deserved. What she's actually doing here is testing the water for something specific, whether you'll react with visible discomfort, or whether you'll stay warm and grounded while she shares something a little vulnerable with you. When a man responds with genuine curiosity instead of jealousy or defensiveness, asking a caring follow-up question instead of quickly changing the subject, she experiences that as safety. It tells her she can be honest with you about her life without you making it about your own insecurity instead. Men who miss this opportunity react with a joke that lands a little too pointed, or they go quiet in a way that signals discomfort rather than interest. The energy in the room shifts, subtly but noticeably, and she feels that shift immediately, even if neither of you names it out loud. Men who recognize the invitation stay present and warm, treating her openness as a gift rather than a threat. That warmth, more than anything clever you could say, is what tells her this is a man worth continuing to open up to. Men who recognize the invitation stay present and warm, treating her openness as a gift rather than a threat. That warmth, more than anything clever you could say, is what tells her this is a man worth continuing to open up to. Imagine she mentions almost in passing that an ex never really listened to her. A man who misses the invitation might crack a joke to lighten the mood, or offer a quick, generic sympathy before steering the conversation elsewhere entirely, uncomfortable sitting in the emotional weight of what she just shared. A man who recognizes the invitation asks one gentle follow-up question, genuinely curious rather than performing concern, and lets her decide how much further to take it. That single follow-up question, more than any reassurance you could offer, tells her that her vulnerability landed somewhere safe rather than somewhere it had to be managed or redirected. Here is the third question, the one I told you to wait for, because it's the clearest invitation of all four, and also the one most older men walk right past without noticing. It usually surfaces once things have started feeling comfortable and familiar between you. She'll ask something that sounds almost like she's just making conversation. Something like, do you think this is actually going somewhere? Or what do you actually want out of this, out of us? Picture it in practice. She asks, half playful but clearly meaning it, whether you see this going anywhere. A man who misses the invitation deflects entirely, saying something non-committal like we'll see what happens, treating the question as pressure to be managed rather than an opening to be welcomed. A man who recognizes it for what it is, answers honestly and warmly, something close to admitting he's genuinely enjoying where this is going and isn't in any rush to define it prematurely, then lets the moment breathe instead of retreating from it. The second response, far more than the first, tells her that her invitation landed exactly where she hoped it would. What most older men get wrong here is assuming this question requires either a guarded, non-committal answer to avoid seeming too eager, or an overly intense declaration to prove how much they care. Both miss the actual invitation completely. She isn't asking for a guarantee about the future. She's asking whether you're actually present with her right now, and whether you're willing to admit that out loud without hiding behind vague, protective language. Now here's something worth understanding, because it explains why this entire pattern matters even more in a relationship with a meaningful age gap. When a younger woman chooses to be with an older man, she is choosing it against a backdrop of outside noise, comments from friends, assumptions from strangers, sometimes even her own occasional doubts. Every one of these three questions is her quietly checking whether the choice she's making is actually safe. Not safe from you hurting her physically, but safe in the sense that her vulnerability will be met with warmth instead of carelessness. This means that when you respond well to these three questions, the impact is often larger than it would be with someone closer to her own age, precisely because she has more riding on the answer. She isn't just finding out whether you're interested, She's finding out whether choosing you, despite the noise around that choice, was the right call. Men who understand this stop treating these moments as small talk to get through and start treating them as exactly what they are, the real conversation happening underneath the words. There's a version of this that plays out even more specifically. If she's chosen to be with someone significantly older, she's likely already had at least one conversation, whether with a friend, a family member, or simply herself, questioning whether that choice makes sense. These three questions often surface not long after one of those internal conversations, functioning almost like a quiet gut check she's running to confirm her own instincts were right. When you respond with warmth and presence in that exact window, you're not just answering her question, you're answering the doubt that prompted her to ask it in the first place, even though neither of you will ever say that part out loud. This is also why rushing to reassure her verbally about the age gap itself tends to backfire. She isn't asking you to convince her with words that the difference in years doesn't matter. She's watching to see if it genuinely doesn't matter to you, through how relaxed and unbothered you are when these ordinary questions come up. A man who brings up the age gap unprompted, trying to address it before she's even raised it as a concern, often signals more anxiety about it than she was carrying herself in the first place. There's also something important to understand about what happens over time once you start actually recognizing these three questions instead of walking past them. This isn't a one-time trick that works on a single conversation and then stops mattering. Every time you respond to one of these openings with warmth instead of deflection, you're not just passing a single moment well, you're teaching her, without either of you naming it, that opening up around you is safe. That lesson compounds. The next question she asks tends to go a little deeper, because the last one was met well. The vulnerability she's willing to offer grows in small increments, each one built on the last one landing safely. This is the opposite of the anxious, one-shot thinking most men bring into these moments, where every conversation feels like a single test that can be passed or failed in isolation. In reality, these three questions show up again and again throughout a relationship, not just at the beginning, and the pattern of how you respond to them becomes the actual foundation the relationship is built on, far more than any single grand gesture ever could. Men who understand this stop feeling anxious about getting one moment perfect and start focusing instead on being consistently present every time one of these openings appears, because it's the consistency, not any single answer, that she's actually responding to underneath it all. Before we go further, it's worth addressing an honest question a lot of men have at this point, which is how you tell these three questions apart from a woman simply being naturally warm and curious with everyone she talks to. It's a fair concern because some people are just generally friendly, and mistaking politeness for interest is its own kind of costly error. The difference usually isn't in the question itself, it's in the follow-through. A generally friendly person asks a version of these questions and moves on regardless of your answer. The curiosity spread evenly across every topic and every person in the room. A woman genuinely interested tends to linger on your answer specifically, asking a small follow-up, referencing what you said again later in the conversation, or even in a different conversation days afterward. She remembers details that wouldn't matter to someone making polite conversation. That memory, more than the initial question, is often the clearer signal, because general friendliness rarely bothers to retain and revisit the specifics of what you said. Another difference worth noticing is exclusivity of attention. If she asks these questions while fully engaged only with you, phone down, eye contact steady, that carries more weight than the same words tossed out while she's distracted or splitting attention across a group. Context around the question matters just as much as the question itself, and men who only listen to the words while ignoring everything surrounding them will keep missing this distinction. Here's where most older men go wrong, even the ones who sense that something meaningful just happened in a conversation. The first mistake is underplaying everything out of a fear of seeming too eager, treating every warm opening she offers as something to be handled cautiously rather than welcomed. The second mistake runs the opposite direction, overreacting to a small opening with too much intensity, turning a gentle invitation into a heavy, serious conversation before it's ready for that weight. Both mistakes come from the same place, not trusting that the invitation was genuine and therefore either shrinking from it or grabbing it too hard. The right response to all three of these questions isn't a rehearsed line for each one. Picture it concretely. She asks what you actually want out of this, half playful, half genuinely curious. The first mistake shows up as a man laughing it off with something non-committal, treating the question like a trap to be avoided rather than an opening to be met. The second mistake shows up as a man suddenly turning serious, launching into a heavier conversation about the future than the moment actually called for, which can feel like too much weight dropped too quickly. The response that actually lands well sits between those two extremes, honest and warm without over-explaining, present without over-promising. That middle path, more than any clever wording, is what these three questions are actually inviting you toward every single time. It's a baseline of warmth and presence that doesn't need to calculate the right answer, because the right answer is simply staying open, honest, and unhurried in the moment she's offering you. When that baseline is there, you don't need to recognize these three questions consciously in real time at all, because you're already responding to them correctly without trying. If you want to build that baseline instead of hoping you get lucky in the moment, it starts with noticing your own patterns after conversations end, not during them. Ask yourself honestly, after she mentioned wanting to know your plans or brought up someone from her past, did you lean toward her curiosity or away from it? Most men never look backward like this, so they never notice how often these three openings have already appeared in their own conversations, unanswered or underanswered, without them realizing what they missed. It also means getting comfortable staying in a moment a little longer than feels natural, instead of rushing to fill silence or change the subject the second something starts to feel personal. A question about your plans or a mention of her past doesn't need an efficient, tidy answer. It's allowed to be met with genuine curiosity and a little more time than you'd normally give it, because that extra bit of presence is often exactly what turns an ordinary exchange into the moment she remembers later. None of this means treating every sentence she says as a coded message to be decoded, scanning constantly for hidden meaning the way we've just spent this video doing together. That kind of constant analysis would create exactly the anxious, guarded energy that closes these doors rather than opening them. The point of understanding these three questions isn't to perform the perfect response on command. It's to recognize, often after the fact at first and eventually in the moment itself, that certain ordinary-sounding conversations were actually invitations the entire time, so you stop walking past them without realizing what was being offered to you. There's one more piece worth naming here, because it's easy to miss. Building this baseline isn't really about getting better at reading her specifically. It's about becoming a calmer, steadier version of yourself in general, one that doesn't need every ambiguous moment resolved immediately in order to feel secure. The men who read these three questions well aren't doing it through some specialized skill of decoding women. They're doing it because they've already done the quieter work of not needing external reassurance every few minutes, which frees up enough attention to actually notice what's happening in front of them instead of managing their own anxiety about it. This matters because it means the work isn't specific to any one relationship or any one woman. It travels with you. The same steadiness that lets you recognize an invitation instead of missing it will show up in your friendships, your work, the way you handle disagreements with people who matter to you. You're not learning a dating trick here. You're practicing a way of being present that happens to show up clearly in exactly these three moments, because these are the moments that require presence the most. So here's the real takeaway from everything we've covered today. She was never hiding her interest from you out of coldness. She was offering it to you in the safest way available to her, through questions instead of declarations, through curiosity instead of exposure. The three questions we covered aren't tests designed to catch you failing. They're doors, quietly left open, waiting to see if you'll notice them and walk through. Before you go, think back honestly. Has a woman recently asked you something that felt small in the moment but stayed with you longer than it should have afterward? That was probably one of these three. Tell me which one in the comments. I read every single one, and I'm genuinely curious which of these lands most for the people watching this. One more thing worth sitting with before we end here. A lot of men watching this will recognize somewhere in the last few minutes a conversation they had recently that they didn't think much of at the time. Maybe it was a question about your week, or a comment about someone from her past, or an offhand remark about the future that you answered quickly and moved past. That's normal. Almost every man has walked past at least one of these without noticing, simply because nobody ever explained what these ordinary sounding moments were actually doing underneath the surface. The difference from here forward isn't beating yourself up over the ones you missed. It's simply staying a little more present the next time one shows up, because now you'll actually recognize it for what it is. And if this changed how you think about conversations you've already had, subscribe. Because in the next video we're going deeper into exactly how to respond in the moment these questions appear, so you never walk past one of these openings again without recognizing it for what it actually is.